The following audio-supported podcast is intended for informational and educational purposes only and is not intended as medical advice. Please speak with your healthcare professional before making any treatment decisions. The guests on today's show were paid to participate in this podcast.
Welcome back to Just Listen, Voices of PK Deficiency. I'm your host, Dr. Rachael Grace. As pediatric providers, we spend a lot of time thinking and learning about how to best prepare children and teenagers over time to transition to adult care. As children get older, it's important that caregivers allow them to find their voice at medical visits, to explain their symptoms and ask questions, and also to begin to understand their care in terms of why they have certain monitoring tests and why they take certain medications or supplements. Finding the just right balance of being an advocate for your child, but also allowing them to find their independence and voice is so difficult. I would encourage caregivers to think about this balance at each medical encounter. And if you don't already, consider encouraging your child to be an active part of the visit as they get older. This will help them to become more independent and ready for transition to adult care over time.
Agios is a biopharmaceutical company that's fueled by connections with patient communities, professionals, partners, and each other. Building on these connections and the company's unmatched leadership in the field of cellular metabolism, Agios is pioneering therapies of genetically defined diseases, a broad group of rare and more common diseases that are typically severe and life-threatening. Near term, Agios is focusing on advancing a clinical pipeline of medicines for hereditary hemolytic anemias. To learn more about PK deficiency, visit knowpkdeficiency.com. That's knowpkdeficiency.com.
Our guests today are Jessica and her son, Travis, and we are grateful to have them on the podcast today to share their experience as a caregiver and teenager affected by pyruvate kinase deficiency. Jessica and Travis, welcome to today's podcast.
Thank you for having us.
I would love to get started by having you tell us about your journey with pyruvate kinase deficiency.
Sure. Travis was born by emergency C-section in 2007. And shortly after being born, within 5 or 6 hours, he had severe jaundice, and he was placed in the NICU with extensive phototherapy and lots of testing and unknowns for 11 days. And he got his first transfusion at 9 days old. We were fortunate enough to have a hematologist that had an idea of what may be causing his anemia. She was very forthcoming from his first appointment at 2 months old that this is what I think it is, but we need to just figure out how to get it tested. Unfortunately, at that time, genetic testing was not as prevalent as it is today. Samples had to be sent to either Sanford or the Mayo Clinic to be tested properly at that time. And within about 6 months, we did get a confirmation that he did have pyruvate kinase deficiency, and his doctor had another patient with pyruvate kinase deficiency, so she had a plan of how we were going to handle this. He was regularly transfused every 4 to 5 weeks up until he was about 5 years old, and at that point, he had a splenectomy, and we went without transfusions until we met other patients and caregivers at the first advisory board for pyruvate kinase deficiency in 2015. And at that point, I spoke with his hematologist at the time about whether or not we wanted to restart transfusions based on some of the information that we heard there. So now he receives exchange transfusions every 8 weeks and is thriving and doing really well.
And when you heard about pyruvate kinase deficiency at that visit back when he was 6 months old, what were you told at that time?
I was given a printout from Medline Plus that was about a page long. And it was just that anytime he spiked a fever or anytime he got sick, that he may need to be seen immediately, and that he's not going to necessarily have his body's not going to have the same reaction to just getting sick and things like that. So to try to keep him as healthy as possible. But his doctor had a plan that had worked with her other patients. So her plan was to keep him growing and thriving throughout his toddler years up until about the age of 5, when it would be safe to remove his spleen. And at that point, it was not even like a question in my mind. That was just like the course of treatment. So we went with it.
Tell me a little bit more about that. What was the decision making like around splenectomy?
I don't think there were really, obviously there's always an option as a caregiver as to whether or not to do a procedure, but it was just the course of treatment at the time. So this is how we minimize the transfusion dependency, is by hopefully removing the spleen, reducing the hemolysis, and then you don't have to transfuse as regularly. That was the end goal, was to try to make it so that way he could continue growing. His body had the energy it needed to develop, but that if we could slow down the transfusions, that reduces the risk of any transfusion side effects. As he has them over and over again, obviously that risk increases with every transfusion. So
it sounds like it was beneficial, at least initially.
And it was. And the thought process to start him on transfusion protocol wasn't so much because he was not thriving still without the transfusions. It was more the long-term side effects of pyruvate kinase deficiency that I was able to hear about from other people who have been living with pyruvate kinase deficiency for decades longer than he has, and how it affects their bodies now that they're older. And they have undergone the similar treatments that he underwent. And I was able to learn from their experiences to say, hey, maybe this isn't the best course. Maybe if we continue to transfuse, at least right now, while he's growing, we can hopefully reduce some of the bone density issues that happen later on in life and things like that. And we're lucky enough that we have doctors that are willing to work with us and understand that we learn from people that have this that they maybe don't have access to. So they were willing to listen, and we started him on regular transfusions, and then we ended up starting apheresis when his doctor realized that we were working against ourselves, trying to lower iron while continuing to pump regular blood transfusions in. So we started the apheresis, and he's been doing that for the last 9 years, maybe 10 years.
And Travis, do you remember when you started transfusions after your splenectomy?
I remember not right after, but it's weird. I remember the splenectomy. I remember going to the hospital and all that. And then a time period I don't remember, and then it picks back up. Hasbro's.
Yeah, and that's when you started back up again.
Jessica, did you notice a difference when he started transfusions after the splenectomy?
I think it gave him more consistent energy, whereas there were definitely times where you would see those dips a little bit more extreme. You would just know he maybe didn't have the hemoglobin level or the energy that he had 2 weeks prior. I think that consistent energy has allowed him to live a more fulfilling childhood and adolescent years where he doesn't feel like he has anything that's holding him back. Occasionally, he still gets a little bit tired, but I think it's more consistent as far as his energy and his ability to try new things, do things. He doesn't feel as though he's held back at all.
And I think people listening may not be that familiar with apheresis. I think people are more familiar with regular transfusions. So would you be willing to talk a little bit about that?
Sure. So apheresis is a transfusion protocol where they are removing your blood. In his case, we only remove the red blood cells, and they do that through a centrifuge. He gets back his platelets and his white blood cells, so that way his immune system can stay strong. And then he gets new red blood cells mixed in. They are warmed up and then replaced into his body. And he started off getting 4 or 5 units every 4 or 5 weeks. And at this point, it's about 9 or 10 units every 8 weeks. So it ends up being about the same volume of blood. It's just that we're doing it less frequently. And by controlling the amount of red blood cells that are remaining in his body, we've been able to maintain his ferritin levels at a normal level. They were dropping through apheresis, and now he stays under 300 as far as his ferritin levels go. So that's fantastic.
And how long does it take each time you have a session?
Start to finish with labs, we're talking usually 4 or 5 hours. But when the machine's running itself, it only takes about 2 to 2.5 hours. we can get up in the morning, get to the hospital, have his labs drawn, get his treatment done, and be home before dinner time. So it's definitely doable within a day. We're lucky enough to only be about an hour away from the hospital that he gets that treatment at. But even if we went down to a larger hospital system, we'd still be able to do it within a day. So I'm happy that it's manageable, and that is how I've always seen pyruvate kinase deficiency. Is it's a disease that we manage as best we can, so that way long-term successes are as great as possible.
Absolutely. And what kind of monitoring do you have on a regular basis?
So he gets blood work drawn when we go in for his transfusions or his apheresis. And with those, his hematologist will check up on him. Usually once a year, they'll come down because we actually, whereas he is now a teenager and he is adult sized, we're able to actually do this procedure down in the blood donor program rather than taking up a room in the pediatrics hematology oncology unit all day. But his hematologist will usually come down once a year, more if there's something that comes up that they need to discuss with us. But for the most part, we see his apheresis team actually every time they stop by while he's in there, make sure that there's nothing new happening, making sure his labs are good, and that we're making sure that we are giving him the proper amount of blood to optimize that hemoglobin level through the process. People
might be wondering too if you need a special catheter to have the type of pheresis you're talking about.
So Travis had a double lumen port when we first started, when he was still much smaller. That was actually failed a few years ago, so we ended up having it removed, and he actually does the apheresis peripherally at this point because he had a port since he was 8 months old. So his veins are in good standing now where we can actually access them pretty well. So we've just been doing it peripherally for now.
Wanted to go back to talking about the splenectomy again. You had mentioned about the decision making at the time, and that helped to decrease the need for regular transfusions for a period of time. How do you both feel now about the splenectomy, looking back on that decision?
I don't feel like it affects me.
That's the answer that I love to hear as a parent, that he doesn't feel affected by it. For me, knowing what I know now, I probably would have held off. And I went through a little bit of this back and forth because there was some research on the fact that the spleen is important to building your immune system. And taking out a spleen too early, could that really long-term hinder somebody's ability to have a proper immune response if they happen to get sick? Now, knowing what I know, that there's so much happening when he was, before his splenectomy, before he was 5, and even when he was 5, there was nothing that I thought was going to happen within his lifetime to change the way we look at pyruvate kinase deficiency as much as the progress that science has made in the last 12 years. So the last decade has been a little bit of a whirlwind. And do I regret it? Not necessarily. If I knew what I knew now, I wouldn't do it, but I don't regret doing it at that time, because at that time, that was the best possible thing to do. But knowing what I know now, I would have probably said, hey, let's keep it for a little while and see where science goes and see what we can figure out about this.
I don't think anyone would have predicted that the treatment and management of pyruvate kinase deficiency would change so much over the last 10 years. And I think everybody who is in your place a decade or more ago had similar decisions to make and the same information available at that time. And now, being a pediatric provider, talking with families who are in that same spot around age 3 to 5, thinking about what treatments consider, the decision-making is so different. It's hard to look back because we had such different information back 10 years ago and different treatment options. And so I think it is an interesting place to be now, comparing the situation that families were in just such a short while ago, 10 years ago.
Absolutely. And I remember his doctor at the time even saying, she started doing some research and she was like, there's not going to be anything during his lifetime, or maybe even his kid's lifetime, but maybe his grandkids or his great grandkids could benefit from research that we do today. The change from grandkids to great grandkids of his, to him being able to potentially benefit from the research that's happening is mind-blowing to me as a parent, at least.
I think mind-blowing to providers too. Even just thinking about what we've learned through people who have participated in registries, just that information in terms of, as you were saying, monitoring that's needed to keep people healthy over time, our knowledge just in terms of what tests should be done and at what ages, that really has expanded over the last 10 years, in addition to having potential new treatments as well. I wonder too, with this expansion of what we know about pyruvate kinase deficiency, there's been a lot of new information available in terms of education for children and for families about pyruvate kinase deficiency. And I wonder how you've found information over time about pyruvate kinase deficiency and how you've worked to educate yourselves. You had mentioned attending a meeting almost 10 years ago and learning a lot there. And I wondered if you could talk more about that. And then over the last 10 years, what you've found to be useful in terms of learning about pyruvate kinase deficiency.
Absolutely. I attended the advisory board meeting in 2015. Within a few years, NORD held another informational type meeting where the FDA and pharmaceutical companies and biopharma companies were invited to come and learn more about pyruvate kinase deficiency. We went there as well to even just sit and listen. To me, listening to others who have this shared experience, learning from what they've learned, allows us to better arm ourselves with the information that we need, as well as looking at scholarly articles that are being able to be published. And as we are able to scientifically confirm different aspects of where this disease might affect from a substantial point of view, the fact that we do have secondary issues that are related to pyruvate kinase deficiency that individually we would have never known were actually secondary conditions. So I think leaning on the community that I've learned is out there, and the pyruvate kinase deficiency community is very much a family where we all have our individual stories and our individual paths that we've taken. Most of them are similar in many ways, but then we all have those little differences because we've all had different doctors throughout the years and different caretakers, and we've been exposed to different information, and we've had the ability to gather that information. No PK deficiency is a fantastic source to have really readily available, easy to digest information for people as well. That's been great. I've used those resources, especially when talking with Travis's school, because they don't have the high level understanding that we do. So some of those resources have been super useful. Say, hey, look at this. This is more streamlined with what you might be able to take in for this. But I think we learn and we gather information from really each other and the paths that each of us has taken. So that way we don't make the same mistakes and we can have those shared victories by understanding this is a success for this person. That might be something that somebody else needs to try. And I think even the older population of patients has realized that getting a transfusion to feel better is okay. And I think that there was initially the stigma where no, like we just got to suffer through. And now it's much more accessible and understandable that you shouldn't have to feel bad. You should be able to do the thing that helps you feel better and live the best life that you can.
Absolutely. I think it's wonderful that the patient community has come together and has a way to come together now, and for people to connect really from all over the world who are affected by pyruvate kinase deficiency. And as you said, maybe getting very different information or have different access to information, and to have the ability to share what works well and what's been recommended to different individuals, I think is incredible. And it's just a wonderful platform that there's a virtual world for people to connect where you don't necessarily have to meet in person if people aren't able to do that, but can connect in other ways. Are there ways that you find your family advocating for people with pyruvate kinase deficiency?
So we definitely have spoken at some different events. We spoke at the Thrive conference a couple of years ago. Obviously, participating in those advisory board panels helps to have researchers better understand what's important to us and what we have seen that works and what concerns we have. And just generally speaking, not hiding the fact he looks like a normal, healthy kid. People don't always understand that he is affected by pyruvate kinase deficiency. So being open and discussing it, I know he discusses it even with some of his teachers and things like that. It comes up that he goes and does some of the speaking engagements and shares his story, as well as sharing my story as a caregiver, because although they are intertwined, the way he feels and is affected by it is not going to be the same that I do, because we're looking at it from two different lenses.
What do you tell the community when you have those opportunities to talk to a group or connect with someone else who has pyruvate kinase deficiency?
I think it's just that we have normalized that because this was the way he was born, and it is a genetic condition that doesn't get better with time, that we have just made it that he knows that this is just the cards he was dealt, and that some days are going to be harder than others. But for the most part, we find a way to live the best life we can with what we have. So I think he really exemplifies that with the way he looks at having pyruvate kinase deficiency. He doesn't see it as this awful thing that he understands, and he's understanding more as he gets older, that listening to his body and knowing when he needs to slow down and take a step back when he's been pushing forward too much. But
sometimes, not all the time, definitely not all the time.
But when he's speaking with others, I think he has a way of just making it a very casual conversation.
I think sharing that outlook with other people would be incredibly helpful. When you're with your friends who don't have pyruvate kinase deficiency, do they ask about it? And what do you tell them about pyruvate kinase deficiency?
People don't know that I have a PKD until I bring it up, like sports. If I'm talking about sports with friends and I'm like, oh, I would play, but PKD, yada. And then I explain it I wouldn't say very dumbed down, but more, I kind of, what's the word I'm looking for? I can't think of it. It's when you relate something to something else.
You give an analogy.
Analogy, yeah. So like one of the analogies I use is the aphereses right now. I'm like, it's pretty much a oil change, swapping all the blood out and then putting brand new blood in. And then I have so many miles with the blood until I need to get it swapped again. So that's one of them. But they're just like, what is it? And I'm like, it's this. And then that's that. So
that's a great analogy.
Yeah.
Explaining the anemia to other people, I think, is incredibly complicated. So it's nice to have a way to explain it to somebody else very simply.
I usually just relate it to cars, and like it's pretty similar, I feel like. So
our bodies are similar to cars.
Yeah.
In terms of your energy level and activities, you were just talking about sports. I wonder how you find that for yourself and what activities you like to do and are able to do.
I like being active. I'm bored if I'm not. So I just have the energy.
You've taken up golfing.
Yeah, I like landscaping. Do a lot of that, like a whole day worth of yard work outside. And then
Working on cars. Yep.
I can't remember anymore.
He also works a lot with the athletic trainer at school.
Yeah.
Because that was, I think, a great way for him to get involved in sports a little bit later in life without the physical demand and the trying to catch up with others who maybe have been playing sports since they were 3 and 4 years old, when we were trying to figure out how we were navigating pyruvate kinase deficiency at that time. So that has been a great sports outlet where he can participate within a kind of team group setting without having to try to play catch up and feeling out of place.
You sound incredibly busy, and I'm impressed that you can do a whole day of yard work outside. Your mom had mentioned about adults feeling like they can advocate for themselves, and if they don't have the energy level that they want, that they should get transfused. And I think that you're sort of reflecting that in terms of your transfusion schedule and your ability to do a lot of different things, it sounds like, and be incredibly active.
Yep. And I also work at Texas Roadhouse. I usually work around 26 hours a week. Gotta get the money.
That's incredible, actually. And you're doing your schoolwork on top of that, too.
Yeah.
And what grade are you in this year?
I'm a sophomore in high school.
So you have all your homework plus work plus all your activities. What do you wish that other people knew about pyruvate kinase deficiency?
I myself have never really thought about it because I don't usually think about PKD on a day-to-day basis because I'm just living. The only time I think about it is when I'm at a transfusion or if I have something planned with Agios, Rocket, Thrive, Nord, any of the companies. I couldn't tell you just because I don't really feel as though it affects me. So I just go on with my day, not thinking about it. But if I wasn't getting the treatment I was getting now and I was more affected by it, probably just that there was a general idea that people had of how it affected you if you had a job and you could only work so much, that your boss understood that and whatnot.
I think what you're pointing out, too, is that everybody's an individual in terms of their experience with pyruvate kinase deficiency, and your experience isn't necessarily the same as the other people that you've spoken with, and that there's some shared experience, but there are also some pretty big differences, too, in terms of how people feel every day and what they're able to do, and trying to educate providers too about that difference between individuals is incredibly important. And so that just because you have one patient as a provider that you've seen with pyruvate kinase deficiency who had certain symptoms doesn't mean that somebody else will be exactly the same, or that the management for one person applies to the next person.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yes.
Travis, when you have your doctor's appointments, it sounds like you meet with the apheresis team on a regular basis. When you meet with them and when you meet with your hematologist, how are your appointments changing over time? Do you find that you're a more active part of the appointment as you get older?
Definitely. We kind of just catch up on life, and then they ask me how I'm doing, if anything's changed, which usually nothing's changed. And then sometimes my mom will mention something if there's something to be mentioned, but I'm definitely more casually involved.
From your perspective, Jessica, how have those appointments changed over time as Travis has gotten older?
So from a very young age, I started to make sure that he was involved in all of the interactions throughout any of his appointments. Once he was potty trained, if they're asking me about going to the bathroom, I was like, he's in charge of that now. You got to ask him, not me. As he progressed in those stages of when, as he is taking more responsibility over his own body just through the general process of getting older, I try to make sure that those things are addressed to him. So that way he would get used to answering those questions and understanding that his body is his responsibility, and that knowing what's going on with your body and listening to your body is important from as early on as you can possibly do that, because those are now conversations that just when he goes in, to him, it's a casual conversation. And because he's been doing it for a lot longer than I think he even realizes, because just preparing them, I think when you have a child who has a chronic condition that will need some kind of lifelong maintenance, it's important that they start that self-advocacy and self-care in a way early on, so that way they can ultimately feel the most comfortable with their doctors and in that setting, and understand that anything that they say within that setting is not going to be judged. It is there because it is information that needs to be shared, so that way the care that he in turn receives is the proper care that he needs at that time. So he goes to his own primary care appointments at this point. He's 16, almost 17 years old. Those are appointments I feel as though he can manage on his own, and he knows I'm usually right outside or a phone call away if he needs me. But I think taking on the more generalized care, even before he's fully an adult, kind of empowers him that much more, even through the more specialized care.
Before we finish up, is there anything else that you'd like to share with the listeners?
I think it's just important to understand that pyruvate kinase deficiency is definitely a lifelong thing that's going to have to be maintained and watched over. But also, you don't have to make it every part. Like Travis doesn't feel affected on that daily basis, but he knows that it's there, and he knows if he's not feeling well, that maybe he's extra tired that day because he is having a dip or his body's going through something that has slowed down production of hemoglobin and stuff like that. So he knows it's there, but he ultimately just lives day to day without it being his main focus. And I think that if you maintain and you set yourself up for that long-term success, that you can have those even immediate successes where you don't feel as though it's a burden, and take those days and enjoy them.
There's something I'd like to add. It's not really a statement. It is a statement, but more of a questionized statement to follow up what my mom just said about being more tired sometimes. Is, would you say that sometimes I could be, when I'm more tired, mood-swing-y?
Yeah. I mean, that coupled with being a teen.
There goes my question. There's more mood swings, which was going to be my question, is if the mood swings were affected from that. So,
well, I think anytime somebody doesn't feel well or feel 100%, you're more likely to not be in a good mood overall. So it makes sense. And that all goes to the mental health part of living with a chronic disease. So
we see that in young children too, who are sometimes too young to express how they feel or to say that they feel tired, that they're instead are mood swings or irritability. So that's consistent throughout the age continuum, that when you don't feel well, that it's hard not to have some mood swings or irritability.
Yeah.
Jessica and Travis, I want to thank you so much for sharing your story and for your positive outlook and for being so forthcoming today. I really appreciate all the time that you spent with us, and I know the listeners will too.
Thank you for having us again.
Thanks for listening to Just Listen, Voices of Pyruvate Kinase Deficiency. Don't forget to hit that follow button in your favorite podcast app so you don't miss an episode. Share the show with members of the PK Deficiency community. And if you'd like to learn more about PK Deficiency and see what resources there are to support people impacted by PK Deficiency, visit knowpkdeficiency.com. That is knowpkdeficiency.com. Thanks for listening. I'm Dr. Rachael Grace, and we look forward to talking with you again.